Get out! Your husband's corpse was the last burden this house will bear. The brother hurled his sister's belongings into the dusty street. He meant every word. The house had been his family's for generations, a small stone structure clinging to the side of a sun-baked hill in rural Morocco. It was 2020, a year of harsh drought that made every mouth to feed feel like a weight. His sister, the widow, had come with her 2 children after her husband died in a factory fire months ago. They were a burden, plain and simple, taking up space and eating food he needed for himself. He had worked hard his whole life, calloused his hands in the fields just to keep this roof over his head. Now she expected him to share it, to carry the weight of her and her orphaned children. Not anymore. He watched the small pile of worn clothes and thin blankets land in the dirt. Before continuing, if you believe a brother should protect his sister and her children, hit that like button and subscribe right now. The youngest child, a girl with wide, frightened eyes, clutched a handmade doll. As the brother shoved a final box out the door, the child dropped the doll. It landed near his worn leather boots. He saw it, a small thing of fabric and stuffing, a symbol of the life he was casting out. He kicked it hard. It skittered across the ground, coming to rest in the gutter. The widow stood silently, her face a mask of sorrow, but her eyes held a quiet strength that angered him. She didn't plead, didn't argue. She simply looked at him, then knelt and placed a clay jug of water at the edge of the porch. "You'll need this more than us," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Then she gathered her children and what little they had and walked away down the dusty road, the 2 small figures trailing behind her. Neighbors watched from their doorways, their faces unreadable, but none stepped forward. None spoke a word. He watched them go until they were just specks in the distance. The house felt empty, but finally it felt like his own again. He turned and went back inside, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. 3 nights later, the brother woke to the smell of smoke. It was thick, acrid, filling his lungs and stinging his eyes. He coughed, scrambling out of his bed. Flames licked at the walls of his room, orange and red against the dark. The heat was intense, pressing in on him from all sides. He stumbled through the smoke-filled house, grabbing only the leather pouch that held his money and papers near the door. The roof groaned above him, timbers cracking and collapsing inward. He threw open the front door and burst outside, gasping for air. The house was an inferno, a roaring beast of fire against the night sky. Flames devoured the roof, sending sparks high into the air. He watched, stunned, as his home, his inheritance, his security crumbled before his eyes. "Fire!" he heard a voice shout. It was the neighbor, standing a safe distance away, pointing toward the edge of the village. "I saw someone run toward the ravine!" the neighbor yelled, his face pale in the firelight. The brother didn't answer. He couldn't take his eyes off the burning structure. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, he saw something near the edge of the collapsed doorway, untouched by the flames. It was the doll, lying in the ashes, its fabric clean, its button eyes staring up at the smoke-filled sky. It looked as if it had been placed there, with his house reduced to smoldering ruins. The brother had nowhere to go. He walked aimlessly for hours, the smell of smoke clinging to his clothes. He carried his small pouch, all he had left. He reached the edge of the ravine, a deep cut in the earth that bordered the village. There, nestled against the rock face, was a small, crumbling shack he had never noticed before. Smoke curled lazily from a makeshift chimney. Desperate, he approached the door and knocked hesitantly. The door creaked open, revealing an old woman. Her face was a road map of wrinkles, her eyes like cracked pottery, watching him with an unsettling intensity. She looked him up and down, her gaze lingering on his soot-stained hands. "You need shelter," she stated, her voice raspy. He nodded, unable to speak. She stepped aside. "You'll sleep here," she said, "for a price." He entered the shack. Inside, it was dark and cramped, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. The walls were bare stone, except for one corner where a framed photo hung crookedly. He looked closer. It was a photo of his sister's children, smiling shyly. How did she have this? As he stood there, numb and exhausted, the small pouch in his pocket shifted. The doll rolled out, landing with a soft thud on the dirt floor. The old woman's eyes widened. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like recognition. The old woman pointed a gnarled finger at a section of the shack's roof. "Fix that," she commanded, "or sleep in the ashes you brought with you." Her eyes held no sympathy, only a hard, assessing gaze. The brother, still reeling from the fire and the shock of seeing the children's photo, nodded mutely. He found some old tools leaning against the wall, a hammer, some loose nails, scraps of wood. He spent the rest of the day working on the roof, his burned hands aching with every swing of the hammer. The old woman watched him from the doorway, silent for long stretches. When she did speak, her words were cryptic. "You look like him," she muttered appeared one time, polishing a framed photo on a small wooden table. He glanced over. It was a picture of a young boy he didn't recognize. Another time, she said, some debts are paid in coin, some in bone. He didn't ask what she meant. That evening, after the sun had set and the air grew cold, she placed a piece of fresh bread and a cup of milk on the table. He stared at it. Fresh bread, milk. It was more than he had expected, more than he had offered his sister and her children. The thought was a bitter taste in his mouth. He ate the bread and drank the milk in silence, the old woman watching him from across the small room. That first night in the shack was long and unsettling. The wind howled through the cracks in the stone walls, a mournful sound that seemed to carry whispers. He lay on a thin mat on the floor, trying to sleep. The doll he had kicked lay nearby. He saw it in the dim light filtering through the cracks. It seemed to vibrate on the floor, as if something unseen was nudging it. He kicked it again, harder this time, sending it into a dark corner. A moment later, he heard a soft scraping sound. He looked. The doll had rolled back, stopping just a foot from his head. Its button eyes seemed to gleam in the dark. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind. He sat up, watching it. He heard a faint humming sound. He looked across the room. The old woman sat in a chair, watching him from the shadows. She was humming a lullaby, a tune that pricked at his memory, something from a long-forgotten past. He had heard it before, but couldn't place it. He lay back down, pulling the thin blanket over his head, but the humming and the feeling of being watched kept him awake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the children's faces from the photo on the wall. The next morning, the neighbor appeared at the shack, looking worried. He carried a small bag of dates. "I brought you something," he said, handing the bag to the brother. "Heard about the fire? Terrible." The brother nodded, taking the dates. "Have you seen my sister?" he asked. "And the children?" The neighbor shook his head. "No, they left that day. Well, you know, nobody's seen them since the fire either. It's strange." He shifted uncomfortably. The old woman stood in the doorway, listening. "Strange," she repeated, her voice dry. "The well where you threw their jug is poisoned now. The water tastes like ash." The brother froze. He had forgotten about the jug of water his sister had left. He had kicked it over later that day, watching the precious water soak into the dry ground near the village well. "Poisoned?" he asked, his voice rough. The old woman just smiled, a slow, knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Some things," she said, "return to where they came from." A sudden, irrational rage surged through the brother. He lunged toward her, his hands outstretched. "What do you know?" he demanded. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, rooted to the spot, her gaze unwavering, her smile fixed. The neighbor stepped back quickly, his eyes wide with alarm. The air in the small shack crackled with tension. The air in the small shack crackled with tension. The brother lunged toward the old woman, his hands outstretched. "What do you know?" he demanded. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, rooted to the spot, her gaze unwavering, her smile fixed. The neighbor stepped back quickly, his eyes wide with alarm. The old woman's smile widened slightly. "I know," she said, her voice a low rasp, "that fire cleanses, but it doesn't forget what was burned." She turned and walked deeper into the shack, disappearing into the shadows near the hearth. The brother stood frozen for a moment, his hands still reaching into empty air. The neighbor cleared his throat. I should go," he stammered, backing out the door. "Be careful." The door creaked shut, leaving the brother alone with the old woman and the unsettling silence. He turned back to where she had gone, but saw only the flickering light from the small fire. The doll lay on the floor near his feet. He kicked it again, sending it skittering under a rickety table. The next few days blurred into a routine of aching labor and sleepless nights. The old woman made him work tirelessly, patching the roof, clearing debris from around the shack, fetching water from a small, murky spring further down the ravine. She gave him just enough food to keep him working. She rarely spoke, but her eyes followed him constantly. When she did speak, it was often about the past, but never directly about him. "Some people," she said one evening, stirring a pot over the fire, "leave pieces of themselves behind when they run. They think they are free, but the pieces remember." Another time, she pointed to the framed photo of his sister's children. "Innocence," she said. "It is the first thing the world tries to burn away." He wanted to ask her about the photo, about the doll, about the poisoned well, but the words caught in his throat. He felt a growing unease, a sense that he was trapped in a place that knew his secrets. At night, the wind still whispered through the cracks, and sometimes he heard faint sounds that weren't the wind. A child's soft cry, a woman's sigh. He told himself it was just the old shack settling, the wind playing tricks, but the doll remained unsettling. Every morning, no matter where he left it, it was closer to him than it had been the night before. He tried burying it outside, but the next day, it was sitting on the step, covered in dirt. dirt. He threw it into the ravine, but hours later, he saw it lodged between two rocks near the spring where he fetched water. Its button eyes seemed to stare at him. Before continuing, if you believe a mother's love is the strongest force on earth, hit that like button and subscribe right now. One afternoon, while he was patching a hole in the roof, he heard the old woman talking near the hearth. He couldn't make out the words at first, but the tone was low and urgent. He climbed down quietly and peered through a gap in the wall. She was talking to a man he didn't recognize. The man had a cruel smile and eyes that darted everywhere. He wore clothes that looked too clean for the ravine. "The house is gone," the man said, his voice low. "Just like you wanted." The old woman nodded. "And the man?" she asked. The cruel-faced man chuckled. "He's here, right where you said he'd be, paying his dues, one splinter at a time." The brother's blood ran cold. This man, he was the one the neighbor saw running from the fire. He was the arsonist, and the old woman knew him. She had planned this. "He took everything from me," the old woman said, her voice suddenly sharp. "Now he has nothing." The cruel-faced man shrugged. "Your vengeance is your own. My payment was the house." He turned to leave. As he passed the photo of the children, he smirked. "He torched his own family first, didn't he?" muttered, then slid out the door. The brother ducked back, his heart pounding. The old woman had orchestrated the fire. But why? Why? And how did she know the arsonist? And why was she keeping him here? He looked around the shack, seeing it now not as a refuge, but a cage. He had to get out. He had to find his sister and the children. He waited until nightfall. The old woman was asleep in her chair by the hearth, her breathing shallow. The shack was dark, save for the faint glow of embers. He crept towards the door. His hand reached for the latch. A floorboard creaked loudly behind him. He froze. The old woman's eyes snapped open. They were wide and unblinking in the dim light. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him. He hesitated, then slowly lowered his hand from the door. He couldn't leave, not with her watching him like that. He needed a distraction, a way to get past her. He looked around the small room, his eyes scanning the shadows. He saw the rug near the table, slightly askew. He remembered stepping on a spot there earlier that day that felt hollow. He walked quietly towards the rug, trying to make no sound. The old woman's eyes followed him. He reached the rug and nudged it with his foot. It slid aside easily, revealing a wooden hatch set into the dirt floor. A cellar. He knelt down, his heart pounding. The old woman was still watching him, her face unleadable. He lifted the hatch. Cool, damp air rose from the opening. He peered down into the darkness. He saw something small huddled in the corner. He lowered himself into the cellar. It was cold and smelled of damp earth. He felt his way along the wall. His hand brushed against something soft. He knelt down. It was the youngest child, asleep, curled up tight. Relief washed over him, quickly followed by a wave of shame. She was here, in this cold, dark place, because of him. She clutched something to her chest. It was the doll. Her breathing was shallow. He reached out to touch her face. Her skin felt cool. He saw a piece of fabric draped over her. It was his sister's scarf, the one she wore the day he threw them out. "Auntie said you'd come," the child murmured in her sleep, her voice faint. "Auntie?" The old woman. He heard a sound above him. He looked up. The old woman stood over the open hatch, blocking the faint light. Her face was grim. "You took their home," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "Now they take yours." She began to lower the hatch. Panic seized him. "No!" he shouted, scrambling towards the opening. "Let me out! Let her out!" The old woman held the hatch firm. "Your sister begged like this," she hissed down at him. On her knees in the dust, he saw the doll in the child's arms. Its painted smile seemed wider, almost mocking. He felt a surge of terror, not just for himself and the child, but for what this woman was doing, for what she represented. He saw a flicker of movement behind her, near the hearth, a shadow. The arsonist, perhaps. He had to get the child out. He had to face whatever was happening. Before continuing, with everything on the line, what choice would you make? Answer in the comments. He lunged for the child, grabbing her gently, but the old woman slammed the cellar door shut, plunging them into darkness. The sound echoed in the small space. He heard the latch drop into place above. They were trapped. "Let us out!" he yelled, pounding on the hatch. He heard the old woman's voice, muffled but clear. "Your sister begged like this," she repeated, her voice laced with bitterness. On her knees in the dust, he heard shuffling sounds above, the movement of furniture. Was she blocking the hatch? He huddled with the child in the corner, the doll between them. He could hear the wind outside, and a new sound now, a crackling, growing louder. Fire! The shack was burning. "Why are you doing this?" he shouted up. The old woman's voice came back, colder than the cellar air. "You look like him," she said, like the man who left me. Who left her? Her voice broke on the last word. I am your mother, she whispered. I abandoned you when you were just a boy. Just like you abandoned your sister. The shack groaned above them. Dust and small stones rained down from the ceiling. The crackling grew to a roar. He heard the old woman scream, a sharp, terrible sound, then silence. He shielded the child with his body as the roof collapsed, timbers crashing down, dust and smoke filling the cellar. A searing pain shot up his arms as burning debris fell on him. He coughed, choking on the smoke. He heard the child cry out. The doll in her arms burst into flames, a sudden flare of light in the darkness. As it burned, the fabric shriveled, revealing something inside, a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of a young woman holding a baby, both smiling, his mother holding him. He pushed himself up, his arms throbbing. The child coughed beside him, but seemed unharmed, protected by his body. He grabbed her and scrambled towards the opening where the hatch had been. The roof was gone, replaced by a gaping hole to the smoke-filled sky. Flames licked at the remaining walls. He climbed out, pulling the child with him. The shack was an inferno. He saw the old woman lying near the hearth, her shawl still smoldering. She didn't move. He carried the child away from the burning structure, stumbling out into the cool night air. He collapsed a short distance away, holding the child tightly. He looked back at the burning shack, then down at his arms. They were raw and blistered. He had saved the child, but at what cost? As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of orange and gray, he walked back to the ruins of the shack. He dug through the smoldering debris near where the old woman had fallen. He found a small wooden box, miraculously untouched by the flames. Inside were stacks of letters, tied with string. He opened one. It was addressed to his sister. He read the first line. My dearest daughter, forgive me. They were letters of apology, written over years, never sent. His mother had been watching them, trying to make amends in her own twisted way. They found the charred remains of the doll nearby. The photograph inside was mostly burned, but he could still make out the image of his mother and the baby. He carried the doll's remains to the small, murky spring where he had fetched water. The spring where the old woman said the well water was poisoned. He dropped the doll into the dark water. He knelt by the spring, retching, emptiness churning in his gut. He stumbled back towards the village, carrying the sleeping child. His burned arms ached with every step. He reached the edge of the village as the sun climbed higher. The neighbor saw him and rushed over, his eyes wide. You're alive, he exclaimed. And the child? Where have you been? We thought after the fire. He stopped, looking at the brother's burns. Your sister, the neighbor said, his voice softer now. She's in the mountains, hiding. She's been there since the fire, with the older boy. He pointed towards the rugged peaks that rose behind a village. The brother nodded, his gaze fixed on the mountains. He had to find them. He had to tell his sister everything. He thanked the neighbor and started walking towards the mountain path, the child still asleep in his arms. The ascent was difficult, his legs heavy, his burned arms screaming with pain. The doll's faint whispers seemed to follow him, carried on the wind. He climbed for hours, the village shrinking below him. He saw smoke rising from a small clearing higher up. He pushed himself harder. He reached the clearing and stopped. There, huddled around a small fire, were his sister and the older boy. They were roasting small, dark figs. His sister looked up, her eyes widening as she saw him and the child. The older boy stood, his face wary. He walked towards them, the child stirring in his arms. The child woke and saw her mother and brother. She reached for them. He gently handed her to the widow. The widow held her daughter tightly, her gaze fixed on the brother's burned hands. Okay, see you in a while. Thank you. She said nothing. The older boy stepped forward, his face hard. He looked at the brother, then spat on the ground near his feet. The brother knelt, pressing his forehead to the dirt, a gesture of submission, of penance. He heard a sudden crackle. The older boy had thrown the charred doll into the campfire. As it burned, he heard a faint sound rise from the flames, a low, humming lullaby. The widow turned away, pulling her children closer. The brother remained kneeling in the dirt as the children's shadows stretched long across the rocks, merging with his own.